Justice in ancient times wasn't about rehabilitation or mercy. It was about spectacle, terror, and the very public reminder that crossing the wrong people could cost you everything. From the searing heat of Egypt's deserts to the frozen mountains of ancient Persia, civilizations across the world developed punishments so bizarre, so brutal, and so creative that they seem almost fictional today. But they weren't fiction. They were reality for countless souls who found themselves on the wrong side of ancient law. Picture this. You're standing in the dusty streets of ancient Babylon around 1750 BCE, watching as a thief is dragged before the towering black stone that bears King Hammurabi's laws. The crowd grows restless, anticipating what comes next. Because in Babylon, justice wasn't just served, it was performed, and the performance was about to begin. The Code of Hammurabi wasn't simply a legal document. It was a promise, a threat carved in stone for all to witness. Its principle of eye for an eye seems almost merciful compared to what actually happened when that principle was applied. Break someone's bone, and yours would be shattered with methodical precision. But the real creativity emerged when the punishment needed to fit crimes that had no physical equivalent. For a baker who sold underweight bread, the punishment was drowning. Not because drowning had anything to do with baking, but because cheating the community was seen as a crime against the very foundation of society. The river gods would judge whether the baker deserved to live. If he floated, he was innocent and free to go. If he sank, well, justice had been served, along with a warning to every other merchant watching from the riverbank. But Babylon was just the beginning. As you move through the ancient world, punishments become stranger, more elaborate, more designed to inflict not just pain, but psychological torment that would echo through generations. In ancient Egypt, where the afterlife was everything, criminals faced punishments that threatened not just their earthly existence, but their eternal soul. The worst offenders weren't simply executed, they were erased. Their names were chiseled out of every monument, every record, every trace of their existence. This wasn't just death, it was spiritual annihilation. In Egyptian belief, to be forgotten was to cease existing in all worlds, forever. But even that wasn't enough for some crimes. Tomb robbers, those who dared to disturb the sacred resting places of pharaohs, faced a punishment called death by 1,000 cuts. This wasn't the Chinese variation you might have heard of. This was uniquely Egyptian, carried out under the blazing desert sun. The condemned would be staked out on hot sand, and small cuts would be made across their body. Not deep enough to kill quickly, but deep enough to attract every fly, every desert scavenger for miles. The sun would do the rest, slowly, over days, while the criminal contemplated their crime against the gods and their eternal damnation. Yet, perhaps no civilization perfected the art of creative punishment quite like ancient Persia. The Persians understood that fear was more powerful than force, and their punishments were designed to create stories that would travel across their vast empire, deterring crime through sheer terror. Take the punishment known as the boats, or scaphism. It sounds almost pleasant, doesn't it? Boats. Maybe a nice day on the water. But the reality was a masterpiece of sustained torture that could last for weeks. The condemned would be stripped naked and placed between two boats, or sometimes hollowed-out tree trunks, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding. They would then be force-fed milk and honey until they developed severe diarrhea, while more honey was smeared on their exposed body parts. What happened next was nature's cruelest collaboration. Insects, drawn by the honey in the waste, would begin to consume the victim alive. Worms and maggots would breed in the filth, eating the person from the inside out while they remained conscious, fed just enough to keep them alive for as long as possible. Some victims reportedly survived for 17 days in this condition. their agonized screams serving as a warning that could be heard for miles. The Persians also pioneered another punishment that would make even hardened executioners pause: molten gold. Reserved for the most serious crimes against the state, particularly treason, this punishment involved pouring molten gold down the throat of the condemned. The symbolism was clear. Since greed for gold had corrupted them, gold would be their destruction. The metal would sear through their throat and internal organs, causing an agonizing death that was both swift and unforgettable for anyone witnessing it. But if you think the Persians were cruel, wait until you encounter the punishments of ancient China, where the bureaucracy of torture was elevated to an art form that would make modern governments weep with envy. Chinese punishments were categorized, systematized, and refined over centuries. There were punishments for every conceivable crime, each calibrated to the social status of both the criminal and the victim. The famous death by 1,000 cuts, or lynching, was reserved for the most heinous crimes: treason, patricide, or crimes against the emperor himself. This wasn't random torture. It was a precisely choreographed dance of pain, performed by skilled executioners who trained for years to perfect their craft. The body was mapped out like a butcher's chart, with each cut designed to cause maximum pain while avoiding vital organs. The process could take hours, sometimes days, with the crowd gathering to watch and learn what happened to those who challenged the divine order. But China's creativity didn't stop at physical torture. They understood that social death could be just as devastating as physical death. The punishment of social erasure involved not just executing the criminal, but obliterating their entire family line. Children, grandchildren, even distant relatives could be enslaved or executed. The family name was forbidden, their property confiscated, and their ancestors' graves desecrated. It was punishment that reached backward and forward through time, ensuring that the crime would have consequences for generations. Yet, even the Chinese might have been impressed by the psychological sophistication of ancient Greek punishments, which often involved the gods themselves in the process of justice. The Greeks believed that certain crimes were so severe, they offended not just human law but cosmic order. For these crimes, simple execution wasn't enough. The punishment had to restore balance to the universe itself. Take the punishment of Tantalus, which became the model for a specific type of torture. Criminals guilty of betraying sacred trusts were subjected to eternal frustration. They would be placed in a pool of water that would recede whenever they tried to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches would rise whenever they reached for food. This wasn't just torture. It was a theological statement about desire, betrayal, and the nature of satisfaction itself. The Greeks also perfected the punishment of ostracism, which sounds mild until you understand what it actually meant. Once a year, the citizens of Athens could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years, without trial, without appeal, and without explanation. The exiled person lost everything: their property, their family, their identity. They became a non-person, wandering the ancient world as a living ghost, neither citizen nor foreigner, belonging nowhere. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating Greek punishment was reserved for those who committed crimes against the family. Parricides, those who killed their parents, were sewn into a leather sack along with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, then thrown into the sea. Each animal represented a different aspect of the crime. The dog for shamelessness, the rooster for aggression toward one's own kind, the viper for cunning poison, and the monkey for mockery of human nature. The condemned would spend their final moments in darkness, fighting off terrified animals while drowning, contemplating how their crime had reduced them to the level of beasts. Yet, if you think Greek punishments were sophisticated, consider the Romans, who turned execution into entertainment and punishment into public spectacle on a scale never before imagined. Roman punishments weren't just about justice. They were about power, entertainment, and social control, wrapped into blood-soaked packages that could draw crowds of 50,000 people. The arena wasn't just a place of execution. It was a theater where the state's power was performed, where justice was dramatized, and where the boundaries between entertainment and terror dissolved completely. Consider the punishment of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This wasn't simply throwing criminals to lions, though that certainly happened. This was elaborate theatrical production where criminals were forced to play roles in mythological dramas, always ending in their death. A criminal might be dressed as Orpheus and given a lyre, expected to charm the wild animals with his music. When the music inevitably failed to work, the beasts would tear him apart while the crowd cheered. Another might be costumed as Prometheus, chained to a rock while eagles or other birds of prey would tear at his liver. The punishment was designed to last for hours, with the criminal's death choreographed to match the mythological story being reenacted. But the Romans reserved their most creative punishments for those guilty of treason against the emperor. These criminals faced crucifixion, but not the simple crucifixion that has entered popular imagination. Roman crucifixion was designed to maximize both suffering and public spectacle. The condemned would first be scourged with a flagrum, a whip embedded with pieces of bone and metal that would tear the flesh from their back. Then they would be forced to carry the crossbeam of their cross through the streets while crowds jeered and threw refuse. The crucifixion itself could last for days, with the victim dying slowly from exhaustion, exposure, and asphyxiation as their muscles gradually failed. But even this wasn't the worst fate Rome could inflict. For the crime of matricide, killing one's mother, Romans had developed a punishment so horrific it was rarely used. The criminal would be sewn into a leather bag with a dog, a cock, a viper, and an ape, then thrown into the Tiber River. The symbolism was complex and deliberate, representing the criminal's descent into bestiality and their rejection of human nature itself. As brutal as Roman punishments were, they pale in comparison to some of the innovations developed in ancient Assyria, where the art of torture reached heights of creativity that still shock modern sensibilities. The Assyrians understood that the goal of punishment wasn't just to eliminate criminals, but to create terror that would prevent future crimes. Their punishments were designed to be talked about, to be remembered, to be whispered about in fearful tones across their empire. One of their signature punishments was flaying, the removal of skin while the victim was still alive. But this wasn't done randomly. Assyrian flayers were skilled craftsmen who could remove skin in large, intact pieces. These pieces of human skin would then be displayed on city walls or draped over siege engines as psychological warfare against enemies. For lesser crimes, the Assyrians developed punishments that were almost artistic in their precision. A thief might have his hand amputated, but the amputation would be performed slowly, bone by bone, joint by joint, over several hours. The victim would be kept conscious throughout, forced to watch as their means of livelihood was methodically destroyed. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating Assyrian punishment was reserved for captured enemy leaders. They would be forced to watch as their families were tortured and killed, one by one, starting with the youngest children. Only after witnessing the destruction of everyone they loved would the leader himself be executed, often by being skinned alive or impaled. Moving eastward, the punishments of ancient India reveal a civilization that understood the connection between spiritual beliefs and physical suffering in ways that created uniquely horrifying forms of justice. Ancient Indian texts describe punishments that were designed not just to punish the body, but to damage the soul itself. The Arthashastra, an ancient Indian treatise on statecraft, describes punishments calibrated to different social castes, with the understanding that the same physical punishment might affect different people differently based on their spiritual development. For Brahmins, the priestly caste, physical punishment was considered spiritually polluting. Instead, they faced punishments designed to destroy their spiritual authority, public humiliation, forced to perform menial labor, or having their sacred thread cut in public ceremonies that would strip them of their caste status forever. But for lower castes, punishments were purely physical, and often involved elaborate torture devices that seemed to have been designed by engineers. One device, described in ancient texts, was called the Wheel of Dharma. The criminal would be tied to a large wheel that would be slowly rotated over a fire, ensuring that every part of their body would be burned gradually over the course of many hours. Another uniquely Indian punishment involved karma itself. Criminals guilty of certain spiritual crimes would be subjected to accelerated karma, where the punishment they received in life was designed to mirror the suffering they would face in their next reincarnation. A person who had caused others to go hungry might be slowly starved to death. Someone who had been cruel to animals might be trampled by elephants or torn apart by tigers in carefully orchestrated executions. Yet even India's spiritual approach to punishment seems almost merciful compared to the systematic cruelty developed in ancient Mexico, where the Aztecs created punishments that incorporated their complex religious beliefs about sacrifice, honor, and cosmic balance. Aztec punishments weren't just about maintaining order in society, they were about maintaining order in the universe itself. Every crime disrupted the cosmic balance, and punishment was designed to restore that balance through carefully prescribed suffering. For adultery, both parties would be stoned to death, but the stoning was performed in a specific ritual pattern designed to mirror the movement of celestial bodies. The first stones would be thrown by the injured party, then by family members, then by the community, each throw representing a different aspect of cosmic justice. But the Aztecs reserved their most elaborate punishments for crimes against the gods. Those guilty of blasphemy or sacrilege faced the punishment known as flaying of the god. The criminal would be tied to a frame, and their skin would be slowly peeled away in strips, which would then be offered to the gods as a form of reversed sacrifice. The victim would remain conscious throughout the process, which could take days, sustained by drugs that kept them alert and aware of every moment of their suffering. Perhaps the most psychologically complex Aztec punishment was reserved for cowards in battle. Rather than simply executing them, cowards would be ritually transformed into women, forced to dress as women, live as women, and perform women's work for the rest of their lives. In Aztec society, where gender roles were rigidly defined and masculine honor was paramount, this transformation was considered worse than death. The former warrior would live on as a constant reminder of what happened to those who failed in their duty to the gods and their community. But even the Aztecs might have been shocked by some of the punishments developed in ancient Celtic societies, where druids created forms of justice that blended magic, psychology, and prolonged suffering in ways that seemed designed to affect not just the criminal, but reality itself. Celtic punishments often involved what they called geas, magical compulsions that would force the criminal to behave in specific ways for the rest of their lives. A thief might be compelled never to touch anything made of metal, forcing them to live as an outcast unable to use tools, weapons, or even eating utensils. A liar might be cursed never to speak the truth again, making them unable to communicate effectively with anyone. But the most feared Celtic punishment was the threefold death, reserved for the most serious crimes against the community. The criminal would die 3 times, first by hanging, then by drowning, then by burning. Each death represented a different aspect of justice. hanging for crimes against the earth, drowning for crimes against water, and burning for crimes against the air. The body would be buried in a bog, where the acidic conditions would preserve it as a permanent reminder of the consequences of serious crime. Archaeological evidence suggests that some victims of the threefold death were kept alive through most of the process, dying only during the final burning. Bog bodies found in Ireland and Britain show evidence of multiple forms of trauma, suggesting that these weren't just execution methods, but elaborate torture rituals designed to extract maximum suffering while maintaining religious significance. Moving north, the Vikings developed their own unique approach to punishment that reflected their beliefs about honor, fate, and the proper relationship between suffering and justice. Viking law was based on the concept of weregild, the idea that every person had a specific monetary value, and that crimes could be compensated through payment. But for crimes that couldn't be compensated monetarily, the Vikings developed punishments that were designed to reflect their harsh environment and their beliefs about the nature of honor. The most famous Viking punishment was the blood eagle, reserved for those guilty of treason or cowardice in battle. The victim would be placed face down on the ground, and their ribs would be cut away from their spine with an axe. The ribs would then be pulled back to create the appearance of wings, and the lungs would be pulled out and spread across the ribs like feathers. The victim would remain conscious throughout most of this process, which could take hours. But the blood eagle wasn't just torture. It was a sacrifice to Odin, designed to ensure that the victim's suffering would be witnessed by the gods themselves. The criminal's pain would become an offering, transforming their punishment into a religious ritual that would benefit the entire community. For lesser crimes, Vikings developed punishments that reflected their understanding of social dynamics and psychological warfare. A man guilty of cowardice might be forced to dress as a woman and perform women's work, but unlike similar punishments in other cultures, this wasn't considered permanent. If the man could prove his courage in a subsequent battle, his honor could be restored. The punishment was designed not just to punish, but to motivate change. Yet, perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated Viking punishment was outlawry, the complete expulsion from society. An outlaw wasn't just exiled, they were declared legally dead. Anyone could kill them without consequences. They couldn't own property, enter into contracts, or even speak to other people. They became living ghosts, existing on the margins of society, neither alive nor dead in any meaningful sense. As we move into the medieval period, punishments became even more elaborate and systematic, with the Christian Church adding theological dimensions to suffering that created entirely new categories of torture and execution that would make even the most creative ancient torturers pale in comparison. Medieval punishments weren't just about maintaining order or even about justice in any recognizable sense. They were about salvation, about purifying the soul through suffering, about giving criminals the opportunity to repent before facing divine judgment. This theological framework created punishments that were designed to be spiritually beneficial to the victim, even as they inflicted unimaginable physical suffering. The Church taught that earthly suffering could reduce time in purgatory, making torture a twisted form of mercy that could last for days, weeks, or even years. The medieval period saw the development of elaborate torture devices that seem almost designed by committees of engineers and theologians working together in the most macabre collaboration in human history. The rack, that masterpiece of mechanical precision, could stretch a human body until joints separated with audible pops that could be heard across the torture chamber. The operators, trained in the art of prolonged agony, knew exactly how to apply pressure to maximize pain while avoiding death, keeping victims conscious and screaming for hours. The Iron Maiden, that coffin lined with spikes, was designed with mathematical precision. The spikes were positioned so that when the victim was sealed inside, they would be pierced but not killed immediately. Instead, they would bleed slowly while standing upright in total darkness, each movement causing the spikes to tear deeper into their flesh. The psychological torture of knowing that any movement meant greater pain, while remaining still meant a slow death from blood loss, broke many victims before the physical torture finished them. The breaking wheel, perhaps the most publicly spectacular of medieval punishments, turned execution into performance art. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, and their limbs would be broken systematically with iron hammers, bone by bone, joint by joint, while crowds gathered to watch and learn. The skilled executioner could keep a victim alive and conscious for hours during this process, finally ending their suffering by striking the chest or neck. But sometimes, in cases of particular mercy, the victim would be strangled before the breaking began, though this mercy was rarely granted. The Judas cradle, that pyramid of agony, forced victims to sit on the pointed tip of a pyramid, their weight slowly driving the point deeper into their body. Ropes and pulleys controlled the descent, allowing torturers to lift and drop victims repeatedly, ensuring maximum pain with each impact. The device could be heated to cause burns or coated with excrement to cause infection, turning a physical torture into a biological weapon that continued working long after the initial session ended. But perhaps the most psychologically complex medieval punishment was the practice of public penance, where criminals would be forced to perform elaborate ritual humiliations designed to demonstrate their spiritual transformation to entire communities. A murderer might be required to crawl on their hands and knees from church to church across an entire kingdom, wearing nothing but a hair shirt made from the coarsest materials, stopping at each church to confess their crime publicly while the congregation watched and judged. These penances could last for years, with the criminal becoming a traveling symbol of redemption and divine mercy, their very existence a sermon about sin and forgiveness that would never be allowed to forget or be forgotten. Some penitents would wear iron chains that grew heavier over time, as rust and corrosion welded them permanently to their bodies. Others carried heavy crosses, stones, or other burdens that would leave permanent physical deformities. The most extreme penances involved self-flagellation, where the criminal would whip themselves raw at each stop, their blood marking their path across the countryside as a testament to their remorse and the power of divine justice. The medieval church also developed punishments specifically designed for different types of sins, creating a taxonomy of suffering that matched spiritual crimes with appropriate physical torments. Blasphemers might have their tongues pierced with hot irons or torn out entirely. Those guilty of heresy faced burning, but the process was carefully orchestrated to maximize both suffering and symbolic meaning. Green wood would be used to create thick smoke that would choke the victim before the flames reached them, while crowds were encouraged to throw additional fuel to speed the process, or pour water to prolong it, depending on the mood of the mob and the severity of the heresy. Thieves faced punishments that mirrored their crimes in twisted ways. A person who stole food might be force-fed until they died from overeating or stomach rupture. Those who stole money might have molten metal poured down their throats. Cattle thieves could be trampled by the very animals they had stolen, while grave robbers might be buried alive in the tombs they had violated, left to contemplate their crimes in the darkness beneath the earth. Sexual crimes received their own categories of punishment that combined physical mutilation with public humiliation. Adulterers might be paraded naked through the streets while being pelted with filth, then subjected to genital mutilation performed publicly to serve as both punishment and deterrent. Prostitutes could be branded on the face or have their noses cut off, marking them permanently as fallen women who would never again be able to hide their shame. The medieval period also saw the development of punishments that lasted beyond death. with the bodies of executed criminals subjected to continued degradation that would serve as ongoing warnings to the living. Criminals might be hanged in iron cages called gibbets, where their bodies would be left to rot slowly while birds and insects consumed them piece by piece. These cages were positioned along major roads, where travelers would be forced to smell the decay and witness the final stages of divine justice. Some medieval punishments were designed to continue for generations, with the families of criminals subjected to ongoing persecution that would mark them permanently as the descendants of evil. Children might be tattooed or branded to identify them as the offspring of murderers or traitors, ensuring that they would face discrimination and suspicion for their entire lives. Property would be confiscated not just from the criminal, but from their children and grandchildren, creating hereditary poverty that would serve as a permanent reminder of their ancestors' crimes. Yet even medieval Christian punishments seem almost civilized compared to some of the innovations developed during the Renaissance, when the rediscovery of classical texts led to a renewed interest in the scientific study of pain and suffering that would transform torture from crude brutality into a precise science of human destruction. Renaissance torturers approached their craft with the same intellectual rigor that artists applied to painting and scientists applied to anatomy, treating the human body as a complex machine whose every component could be manipulated, damaged, and repaired to extend suffering indefinitely. They studied corpses to understand nerve pathways, muscle groups, and bone structures, learning exactly how much pain could be inflicted without causing death, how to prolong consciousness during torture, how to maximize psychological as well as physical suffering through systematic application of scientific principles. The Renaissance was the golden age of torture manuals, detailed instructional texts that described precise techniques with the same methodical attention to detail found in architectural treatises or medical texts. These manuals contained anatomical drawings showing optimal placement for torture devices, timing charts indicating how long different procedures could be sustained, and even psychological profiles describing how different personality types responded to various forms of pressure. Master torturers became respected professionals, passing their knowledge to apprentices through years of hands-on training that would make modern medical education seem casual by comparison. The result was a series of torture devices and execution methods that represented the pinnacle of human creativity applied to human suffering. Mechanical marvels that combined engineering precision with artistic attention to detail. The Spanish Inquisition developed techniques that could keep a victim conscious and in agony for days or even weeks, using carefully calibrated combinations of pain, drugs, and medical intervention to maintain awareness while preventing death from shock or blood loss. The strappado, where victims were hung by their arms tied behind their backs, became a masterpiece of controlled destruction. Operators could dislocate every joint in the body systematically, starting with fingers and working up to shoulders, while keeping the victim alive and aware throughout the process. Weights could be added to increase the tension gradually, and the victim could be raised and dropped repeatedly to maximize joint damage. Skilled operators could keep a victim hanging for hours, adjusting the tension to prevent unconsciousness while ensuring maximum pain from each dislocated joint. The water torture developed during this period went far beyond simple near drowning. Victims would be strapped to tables with their heads lower than their feet, and water would be poured slowly over cloth covering their faces, creating the sensation of drowning while preventing actual death. The psychological terror of believing you are about to die, repeated over and over, could break even the strongest will within hours. Some victims would confess to anything, rather than face another round of simulated drowning, while others would go mad from the repeated experience of thinking they were about to die. Renaissance torturers also perfected the art of heat-based torture, developing devices that could apply precisely controlled temperatures to different parts of the body. Iron boots could be heated gradually while worn, slowly cooking the victim's feet while they remained conscious and aware. Branding irons were designed in elaborate patterns that would tell stories about the victim's crimes, turning their body into a permanent record of their transgressions that would mark them for life if they survived. But Renaissance torturers also understood psychology in ways their predecessors hadn't, developing techniques of mental torture that could destroy a person's sanity without leaving physical marks that might interfere with their confessions or testimonies. Sleep deprivation became a science, with torturers learning exactly how long a person could be kept awake before hallucinations began, and how to maintain that state of exhaustion and confusion for weeks without allowing the victim to die from exhaustion. Sensory deprivation chambers were designed to remove all stimulation from the victim's environment, creating a form of psychological torture that could drive people insane without any physical contact. Victims would be placed in completely dark, soundproof cells, sometimes with padded walls that prevented them from injuring themselves, and left alone for days or weeks with only irregular feeding to mark the passage of time. The complete absence of human contact, combined with the inability to distinguish day from night, would gradually destroy the victim's sense of reality and connection to the outside world. Constant noise torture involved subjecting victims to unending sounds, bells, drums, or human voices that would prevent sleep and gradually destroy their ability to think clearly. Some torturers would use irregular rhythms that would prevent the victim from adapting to the noise, keeping them in a constant state of stress and exhaustion. Others would use sounds that had personal meaning to the victim, such as the voices of their family members crying for help, creating psychological torture that attacked their emotions as well as their sanity. The threat of violence against family members became a systematic tool, with torturers sometimes bringing the victim's children or spouse into the torture chamber to witness the proceedings, creating layers of psychological pressure that went far beyond the physical pain being inflicted. Some victims would break simply from knowing that their loved ones were watching their suffering, while others would confess to false charges to prevent their families from being subjected to similar treatment. Perhaps the most sophisticated Renaissance punishment was developed by the Venetian Republic for crimes against the state, a process that combined physical, psychological, and social destruction in ways that would permanently destroy every aspect of the victim's identity and humanity. Traitors would be subjected to a process called the 1,000 Days, where they would be kept in solitary confinement for exactly 1,000 days, a period carefully calculated to be long enough to break even the strongest will, while short enough to prevent death from natural causes. The cells used for this punishment were masterpieces of psychological architecture, designed to be just large enough for the victim to lie down, but too small to stand upright or stretch out fully. The walls were curved to prevent the victim from determining the size or shape of their prison, and the lighting was carefully controlled to prevent them from distinguishing day from night. They would be fed just enough to keep them alive, but the timing of meals would be completely irregular, preventing them from using hunger to mark the passage of time. Sleep would be allowed for only a few hours each night, but the timing would be unpredictable, with torturers sometimes allowing 8 hours of sleep, sometimes only 1, sometimes keeping the victim awake for days before allowing rest. This irregular schedule would gradually destroy their circadian rhythms and ability to think clearly, while the constant exhaustion would make them more susceptible to the ongoing interrogation about their crimes. The interrogation itself was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, with skilled questioners who understood exactly how to exploit the victim's mental state to extract confessions or information. They would ask the same questions over and over, in slightly different ways, looking for inconsistencies that could be used to break down the victim's resistance. They would make false claims about the victim's family or friends, suggesting that others had already confessed and implicated them. creating paranoia and desperation that would make the victim more likely to cooperate. The psychological pressure was enormous, carefully calibrated to push victims to the very edge of madness without allowing them to escape through complete mental breakdown. Many victims confessed to crimes they hadn't committed just to end the suffering, while others began to believe that they actually were guilty of the charges against them, their memories becoming so confused that they could no longer distinguish reality from the false confessions they had been forced to make. Others went completely insane, spending their days talking to imaginary companions, or reliving their crimes in elaborate hallucinations that became more real to them than their actual memories. Some developed multiple personalities as a way of coping with the isolation, creating internal companions that could provide the human contact they were being denied. Still, others simply died from the stress, their bodies shutting down from the constant psychological pressure, their hearts stopping from the accumulated trauma of months or years of systematic mental torture. The Venetian system was particularly cruel because it was designed to continue working even after the victim was released. Those who survived the 1,000 days were often so psychologically damaged that they could never function normally in society again. They might be physically intact, but their minds had been permanently altered by the experience, leaving them as living warnings about the consequences of defying the state. Some would spend the rest of their lives in a state of constant anxiety, jumping at shadows and trusting no one. Others would become obsessed with confessing to crimes, real or imagined, unable to stop themselves from seeking punishment for transgressions that existed only in their damaged minds. Yet, even as these punishments reached new heights of sophistication and cruelty, they were already beginning to face criticism from philosophers and legal scholars who questioned whether such extreme suffering could ever be justified, regardless of the crime committed. This intellectual revolution would eventually transform the entire concept of justice and punishment in ways that continue to shape our modern world. The Enlightenment brought with it new ideas about the purpose of punishment, the nature of justice, and the proper relationship between the state and the individual that challenged thousands of years of accepted practice. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that punishment should be swift, certain, and proportional to the crime, not elaborate spectacles of suffering designed to terrorize the population into submission. His treatise on crimes and punishments became a revolutionary document that questioned the very foundations of traditional justice systems. Beccaria argued that the goal of punishment should be deterrence and rehabilitation, not revenge or spectacle. He pointed out that the most elaborate tortures often had little deterrent effect because they were so extreme that people couldn't really imagine them happening to themselves. Instead, he advocated for punishments that were moderate but certain, arguing that the knowledge that crime would definitely be punished was more effective than the fear of extreme but unpredictable torture. Other Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, John Stuart Mill, and Jeremy Bentham developed philosophical frameworks that emphasized individual rights and human dignity in ways that made traditional punishments seem not just cruel, but counterproductive. They argued that torture and public execution actually corrupted society by normalizing violence and teaching people that extreme cruelty was acceptable when sanctioned by authority. These ideas gradually led to reforms in criminal justice systems across Europe and eventually around the world, though the process was slow and often met with fierce resistance from those who benefited from the old systems. Public executions became less common as reformers argued that they were turning justice into entertainment and corrupting public morals. Torture was officially abolished in most countries, though it often continued in secret or was simply renamed as enhanced interrogation or intensive questioning. Punishments became more focused on rehabilitation than on retribution, with the development of modern prison systems that were designed to reform criminals rather than simply warehouse them until execution. The Pennsylvania system emphasized solitary confinement and reflection, while the Auburn system focused on communal work and discipline. Both approaches represented radical departures from traditional punishment, treating criminals as human beings who could potentially be reformed rather than as irredeemable monsters who deserved only suffering. But the transformation wasn't uniform or immediate. Even as some countries were abolishing torture and moving toward more humane punishments, others were developing new forms of systematic cruelty that would make ancient punishments seem almost merciful by comparison. The rise of totalitarian governments in the 20th century led to the development of punishment systems that combined modern technology with traditional cruelty in ways that created unprecedented levels of suffering. The Soviet Gulag system imprisoned millions of people in conditions that were designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimum survival resources. Prisoners faced systematic starvation, exposure to extreme cold, backbreaking work quotas, and complete separation from their families and normal human contact. The system was designed not just to punish individual crimes, but to terrorize entire populations into compliance with state ideology. Nazi concentration camps took systematic cruelty to even greater extremes, combining elements of ancient punishment traditions with modern industrial efficiency to create systems of destruction that could process millions of victims with mechanical precision. The camps weren't just places of execution, but laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance and degradation. Places where traditional concepts of crime and punishment were replaced by racial ideology and scientific experimentation. But even these modern horrors didn't represent complete breaks from historical tradition. The techniques used in modern torture and systematic oppression often drew directly from ancient and medieval practices, updated with modern technology, but based on the same fundamental understanding of how to break human will and spirit. Waterboarding, for example, is essentially the same technique that was used during the Spanish Inquisition, while solitary confinement uses the same psychological principles that made medieval oubliettes so effective. The legacy of these ancient punishments remains with us in ways that are both obvious and subtle, shaping our modern concepts of justice, our ideas about the proper limits of state power, and our understanding of human rights in ways that we often don't fully recognize. Our modern concepts of justice, our ideas about the proper limits of state power, our understanding of human rights, all these have been shaped by centuries of reaction against the excesses of ancient and medieval punishment systems. When we read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with its prohibitions against torture and cruel punishment, we're reading a document that was written with full knowledge of what humans are capable of inflicting on each other when given unlimited power over other people's bodies and minds. The specific language used in these documents often reflects direct responses to historical practices, with phrases like cruel and unusual punishment being written specifically to prevent the kinds of elaborate torture that characterized earlier eras. Our modern legal systems, with their emphasis on due process, proportional punishment, and individual rights, represent a direct rejection of the arbitrary justice that characterized ancient and medieval societies. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, the prohibition against self-incrimination. All these procedural safeguards were developed specifically to prevent the kinds of abuses that made ancient justice systems so terrifying and unpredictable. Even our modern prison systems, despite their many flaws and criticisms, represent a fundamental shift away from punishment as spectacle toward punishment as rehabilitation. The idea that criminals can be reformed and returned to society as productive citizens would have been incomprehensible to most ancient societies, where crime was seen as a permanent stain that could only be erased through suffering or death. But the influence of ancient punishments extends beyond formal legal systems into our popular culture, our literature, and our collective imagination in ways that reveal how deeply these practices have shaped human consciousness. Horror movies, crime dramas, and thriller novels often draw directly from ancient punishment traditions, using the same techniques of psychological terror and physical suffering that made ancient executions so effective as tools of social control. The popularity of these forms of entertainment suggests that there's something in human nature that remains fascinated by the spectacle of suffering, even when we intellectually reject the practices that created it. We're simultaneously horrified and intrigued by accounts of ancient torture, drawn to understand how such things could happen, while hoping that we would never be capable of inflicting such suffering ourselves. This psychological complexity reflects the fundamental ambiguity in human nature that made Jaishi punishments possible in the first place. We're capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary compassion, often simultaneously, and our responses to accounts of historical suffering reveal as much about our own psychological makeup as they do about the societies that created these practices. The strange and harsh punishments of ancient times weren't aberrations or curiosities that can be dismissed as products of more primitive eras. They were systematic expressions of how different civilizations understood justice, power, suffering, and the proper relationship between the individual and society that reveal fundamental truths about human nature and social organization that remain relevant today. These punishments were designed to do more than simply remove criminals from society or deter future crimes. They were designed to reinforce social hierarchies, to demonstrate the power of rulers, to provide entertainment for the masses, to satisfy religious requirements, and to create the kind of terror that would make people think twice before challenging authority. In many ways, they were extraordinarily successful, allowing ancient empires to maintain order across vast territories with relatively small numbers of administrators and soldiers, relying on the fear generated by these punishments to keep populations in line. The spectacle of suffering became a form of governance, a way of communicating power that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. When someone was publicly flayed in an Assyrian city, the message was understood not just by the local population, but by travelers and traders who would carry news of the punishment to distant lands, spreading fear of Assyrian justice across the known world. But these punishments also reveal the human capacity for creativity in service of cruelty, the ways that intelligence and imagination can be turned toward the systematic infliction of suffering in ways that should serve as permanent warnings about the dangers of unchecked power. The elaborate devices, the careful choreography of pain, the psychological sophistication of many of these punishments, all this represents human ingenuity applied to the darkest possible purposes. The fact that such elaborate systems of torture could be developed, refined, and maintained across centuries suggests that the capacity for cruelty isn't just an individual failing, but a social phenomenon that can become institutionalized and normalized under the right conditions. Ordinary people can become torturers, executioners, and spectators of suffering when the proper social and psychological conditions are created. A truth that should make us deeply suspicious of any system that concentrates too much power in the hands of authorities. Perhaps most importantly, these punishments remind us that the concepts of human dignity and individual rights that we take for granted today are relatively recent innovations in human history that must be actively maintained and defended. For most of our existence as a species, the idea that every human being possesses inherent worth that places limits on how they can be treated was not widely accepted, and there's no guarantee that this idea will continue to be accepted in the future. The movement away from these kinds of punishments represents one of the most significant moral advances in human history. A recognition that even the worst criminals retain some spark of humanity that cannot be extinguished through torture or spectacular execution. But this recognition wasn't achieved automatically or permanently, and it requires constant vigilance and active commitment to maintain. Yet, even as we congratulate ourselves on our moral progress, we should remember that many of these punishments continued well into the modern era, and that similar practices continue in some parts of the world today. Public executions were common in the United States until the 1930s, and torture was routinely used by democratic governments as recently as the 20th century. The capacity for cruelty that created these ancient punishments remains part of human nature, held in check not by any fundamental change in what we are, but by institutions, laws, and cultural norms that can be fragile and impermanent. The strange and harsh punishments of ancient times serve as a reminder of what we're capable of, both in terms of inflicting suffering and in terms of moving beyond that suffering toward more humane forms of justice. They are part of our history, part of who we are, and part of what we must continue to guard against as we build societies that respect the dignity and worth of every human being. In the end, these punishments tell us as much about justice as they do about injustice, as much about humanity as they do about inhumanity, and as much about our capacity for moral progress as they do about our capacity for cruelty. They remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we might like to believe, and that maintaining that line requires constant effort, constant vigilance, and a constant commitment to the idea that even in the face of the worst crimes, some things remain unacceptable. The echo of ancient screams still reverberates through our modern legal systems, not as an endorsement of cruelty, but as a warning of what can happen when power is unlimited and when suffering becomes entertainment. In remembering these punishments, we honor not just the victims who endured them, but the long struggle toward a more just and humane world, a struggle that continues today and will continue long into the future, as each generation must choose whether to build on the moral progress of their predecessors or slide back into the darkness that these ancient punishments represent.